Your host for the program called The Writer's Eye. And tonight my guest is Roger Heath. Roger has done a lot of writing. I guess to start out the program, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of your influences, one of which is Ernest Hemingway. And I think Hemingway had some theories about writing that you've mentioned. There's at least three things that he mentioned about writing and characterized it.
Yeah, he was probably a better writer about writing than most writers, and some of his writing about writing was better than his writing in some cases. But he had a number of principles that seemed to work very well in terms of instructing somebody on how to improve their writing or how to write. And one was the idea that you sculpt away all the words that don't move the story or the idea forward, and leave sort of a concentrate of aesthetics or values or ideas behind.
I think actually Michelangelo said something similar about sculpting, that the actual
take away everything that's
take away everything that's not the form. Yeah, the way he phrased it was, the more the marble wastes, the more the statue grows, which is a very interesting way of phrasing it, I think.
But you have to not slip and take away too much.
that's the art.
or leave too much.
Which actually Hemingway, could you say his art is sort of minimalist in that sense, that he's sculptured down to the essential?
I guess, yeah. As maybe Faulkner was a cubist, he was a minimalist. Faulkner tended to put everything in from every angle, so that you looked at things about a dozen different ways from different points of view. And,
yeah, Joyce did that too.
And I guess I like the bullion better than than the bouillabaisse.
Ever writing. What other tips did he have for writers?
The best tip for me is that never stop writing when you're stuck. Stay there until you get going, and know what your next thing is. As long as it's one step more, when you go back, you start in, and then you get stuck. But you can get unstuck before you leave. If you're stuck and you put it into your subconscious that you'll think about it, sometimes it comes up on the screen later, and sometimes it doesn't. And you can stop writing pretty definitively if you do that. So yeah. I found that very good piece of advice.
Do you know if Hemingway worked on several works of fiction at once?
I think he did. Particularly he was always working on his Land, Air, and Sea trilogy, most of which never got published, because most of which was just not suitable for publication. The Islands in the Stream was a portion of it, but it was probably as heavily edited as some of Tom Wolfe's stuff. I mean, it was taken from a very large manuscript, no doubt.
And we have the original manuscript?
Yeah.
I understand, actually, that Dickens did that, too.
In fact, for some very strange coincidences, the best collection of Hemingway material is in the John F. Kennedy Library in Boston.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and anyone can go in there and actually read it?
All you have to do is say that you want to study it and sign in, and the material itself you don't have access to, but they have copies of everything, and if you were a proven scholar, they would let you look at the originals.
At the originals, but you can look at Xerox copies, say, or something like that? Yeah. Anybody can do that?
Anybody.
And there's a lot of unpublished Hemingway right there, then?
There's a whole lot of it, and letters.
Wow.
And letters that, for whatever reasons, many weren't included in the complete letters.
Complete letters, yeah, I always love that. There's always something left out of the complete letters.
I don't think that there's ever been a complete letters of anybody.
No, that's true. Complete is
unless the person was illiterate and only wrote one.
Then it would be the complete letter.
I wish you were here.
That's great. Well, it's the material that's there, then, Hemingway's other side, so to speak. I mean, Hemingway is generally known for the minimalist dialogue, get across a lot of information in a small amount of words. But there probably is another side that he had to brainstorm in order to get to that point, right? And then a lot of that would be accessible in the Kennedy Library?
Yeah, I don't know what his thinking process obviously was, but Hemingway was a bit of a phony, too. And you know, even in his letters, he put people on. So I'm not sure that you get into his brain entirely through even some of his letters. But you know, it's the mother lode of Hemingway memorabilia, and I shouldn't say memorabilia. Mostly, it's written.
But a side to Hemingway that we don't normally have access to.
I don't know that there's any side left to
How
not
many
have
biographies
access
have been
to.
written about him? Maybe 100 or something?
I've got about 30, and I'm sure that there's an awful lot more. And they're written by almost all of his siblings, by his children, by his contemporaries, by people that never knew him. He's been over-biographed, I think.
He became sort of like a superstar of writers.
He did. He even once did a beer commercial, I found.
Did he really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know how he'd fare in a meteor age, but I mean, he loved the meteor, and I think he would have succumbed to it, and even more than he did. And
starting out as a journalist, and you know, he would have to be very much aware of public interest or things that caught the reader's eye. But he evolved up from that to a more like the tragedy underneath the.
I'm not sure that arguably he wasn't a better journalist and short story writer than he was a novelist, and yet he's noted for his novels. But,
yeah.
I don't think most of his novels reach the heights of his short stories and some of his journalism.
Because of this really compacting,
I think
image.
The journalistic training led him to most of which he was cabling across, and it was a cost value, and also Gertrude Stein always suggested that he reduce things down. But, she was a better teacher than she was a writer.
That's right. She was into repetition and various other things. Yeah. Hemingway, of course, being known for his dialogue, when you started to write, did you emphasize or focus on dialogue as the beginning as opposed to description?
No, I think most people start out with description, and I did to a fault.
Really?
To a lot of faults, and went through a Faulkner-esque period and a Hemingway-esque period, and then finally just sort of found my voice. At least, you know, the way I write now, I'm no longer conscious of the style as it evolves. But it was helpful to go through that period. And I suppose it's like a copyist in a museum. You copy the great masters, and you learn something about the process from doing it.
Yeah.
And copying or aping or satire is generally put down, but I think it's a good training.
Yeah.
And as long as it evolves from there, and if it doesn't, I don't know that there's any great sin committed.
Do you know the origin of the term masterpiece? It actually refers to something very similar to this.
Oh.
Painters could only learn from copying in the Renaissance, and they were apprentices, in effect. So they did different various stages of their work, and when you move from apprentice to master, you have to produce a piece of work that will show that you are now capable of becoming a master. That's the masterpiece. That's where the term comes from.
I know instrument makers used to, their final piece was, when they got through their apprenticeship, was a miniature instrument that was actually playable.
Wow.
So I guess they
Hemingway-esque,
felt that if they could do it in that scale, then they can certainly do it in a larger scale where mistakes wouldn't be magnified. So.
So are there a lot of these little instruments all around, all over the place? Or did they
They're
disappear?
collector's items, yeah.
There's a smaller Stradivarius that a mouse can play or something? It reminds me of the blind lemon
Guarneri mouse, yeah.
I wonder if a matchbox will hold all my clothes. That's right. We were talking about the difference between dialogue and description. I don't know, maybe there isn't ultimately any difference, but when you're a writer, you have to decide when your characters are conveying information, and dialogue really means that there's an element of subjectivity that's telling you how the character thinks, whereas description could be the writer, but you can also write description from the point of view of somebody who is a limited narrator. So you have to make a lot of decisions when you start writing. Do you want the description to be yourself as a writer? Do you want it to be objective, or do you want it to carry something across from the person who's actually writing the description.
But dialogue is a description of the interior person. I mean, they're giving away more than they're saying
Yes,
in
right.
everything that they say, just as gestures and movement. And in fact, that's
Body language.
Yeah, I think that's you have to combine in writing any dialogue. You have to combine the body language, or you've lost half the dialogue.
Excellent point.
There's a physicality to dialogue, and there's a descriptive aspect to dialogue as well.
There's a great scene in a movie, I guess it was in the 50s, in which character is asked how many drinks he's had, and he says 2, and he holds up 3 fingers. And that to me always, if you just had the 2...
If you just had the dialogue without the description.
Just had the dialogue, you wouldn't realize that there's a subtext going on. So Hemingway then would have been very much aware of gesture and how the lines were said, as giving you the context to understand. So it's somewhat misleading to say he's just writing dialogue, because what he's actually writing is the context of the dialogue as well.
And his dialogue, I guess, being in the legislature and reading transcripts of direct dialogue, you get a real feel that people don't speak in full sentences, and lots of times there's an understanding and when you're reading these transcripts, you're missing something, but you remember the testimony, you'll remember gesture or something that was going on, and you'll understand suddenly what you can't understand just reading the exact words that people say. But it's in fact, the one place that helped me learn dialogue, I guess, was reading the transcripts of I forget now the name of the report, but it was about the riot in Chicago during the Democrat convention.
Oh, yeah.
When the report came out on that, there was an awful lot of dialogue just in transcripts. And reading those transcripts, I got a sense of how people speak that is very different from the way we think we speak or we think we hear people. I mean,
it's sort of like when you hear your voice on a tape recorder. It doesn't sound like you. It sounds like someone else.
To you, but to everyone else.
Yeah, they're saying that issue. That's me, you're saying. But I think a writer is constantly up against that type of balance, because you're not only writing from your own point of view, you're writing from a character's point of view. And you have to make the character someone other than yourself. Obviously, a large part of yourself.
So you write that part from your ear and the other part from your mouth, I guess.
Well, or something like that. But it's fascinating, too, that you mentioned your legislative experience. My guest is an ex-senator from New Hampshire. Because legislative intent is so difficult to determine a lot of times, and what you do is go back to the transcript. But
that's
you're
presuming that they have an intent.
Yes, exactly.
Which is quite
everyone has an intent. The problem
I don't know.
It's very conflicting.
Over the years, I saw some that had no intent at all.
Well, the intent is to get the law passed, right? Or actually to kill the law.
For some, yes.
For some, right. Yeah, when we were talking earlier in preparation for this program, I mentioned I worked for the legislature too, but as staff. And there was a phrase that kept coming in my mind all the time, which is all things must pass. But after a while, I substituted laws for things. All laws must pass. Pass being not only they go into effect, but also that they have to pass away. They have to continually be renewed. It's almost as if there's a reincarnation or,
well, I think that's
some theory of religion behind law.
That's what keeps legislators in there so long. They start building a small body of legislation that they have written and take great pride in, and
pride of authorship.
They sort of stay around to guard it, because they know the moment they leave it, it will evolve into something else. And
that's exactly what happens.
It's an evolutionary kind of thing.
But to some extent, what law tries to do is extrapolate out what is a precedent or what is long-standing, sort of an archetype, at the same time as you're in the midst of constantly changing stuff. So the labels conservative or liberal really are actually not that correct, because
they have over the years almost reverse poles.
Yeah, they go around, and the reason for that, I think, is because law is always a tension of opposites. It's always trying to take a past idea of doing something and figuring out how it relates to a current situation. And if you're ignoring the current situation, you're not writing very good laws, which means that you have to be very contemporary at the same time as you're being conservative, But if you're trying to be liberal and change, you also have to be aware of what worked before, so that there's a large element in both
Work
of
may
those.
be, you know, I think law is always optimistic. It always looks to a cure or to a solution, and very seldom achieves it in any marked degree. I mean, the stalking bill. Stalking is a agreeable bad thing, and sometimes a dangerous thing.
Except a stalker.
But the legislation won't stop stalking. I mean,
no, that's right.
You know, legislation doesn't stop things. It addresses them. It may make more of a punishment. It may make more of a discouragement. But there's a satisfaction, and this is where I think legislators lose some vision. They've taken care of stalking. Now they'll move on to another problem.
You
and
create the illusion that
and there's this optimism. Well, we've done that, and that will just go out and have an effect. They don't look back. There'll be something else next year that'll be hot.
Yeah. I have a
they'll make
personal
something
version of that, sort of, that I need to add in parenthesis. I've stopped reading books and just Xeroxing them. It's as if I've read them when I Xeroxed it. You know, like,
that's an idea.
Yeah, right. But well, I think that's the way human nature works a lot of times, is you invent something to talk about something else, and you settle it in the area that you've invented it in. But when you come back to reality, it's quite different. And again, I think writers have to be very aware of the fact that they've created a scenario that works within its own logic and its own world, but can you ground it in the real world? Are you actually talking about something that has a referent when you go back to reality, or have you gone off into the stratosphere and written? It's the paradox of fiction, really. How much of fiction is truth? How much is it extrapolate out
Well,
real events?
but that also works into how much works that's accidental, and how much work, you know, and part of any art is discovering the accidental things
That's
that
the great
work
thing about
and
it.
leaving them alone. And I think sometimes in the law, they've done things accidentally that were better than some of the things they've done intentionally,
Right.
and had the good sense to leave it alone.
Good
sometimes,
sense.
Sometimes
and law
they,
in the same breath. That's
they have,
what
well, it's a stretch.
That's great. The voice of experience talking. Well, there's another side to this, too, and we mentioned it in our conversation before the program, and that is that there's an impression of the way things are versus the way things actually are. And another side to this is that we have a really interesting concept of what classical art is, but when you start to investigate it, it turns out to be something quite different. I noticed that when I, excuse me a second while I reach down for something here, but Greek statues were, we think of them as very classical and as very gray, as being very simplified in their design.
As in-
generally thought of as classical.
As in missing limbs, which is
Yeah, yeah.
quite a simplification.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that is minimalist art, right? Venus de Milo doesn't even have any arms.
What an ingenious idea.
Yeah, right. And maybe the accident there was better. But we have here a postcard that shows what a Greek statue actually looks like, and it's very painted and even gaudy to a large extent. There's even a little halo or flying saucer or whatever you want to call it. It's actually funny. I mean, in some ways. There's a whole side to classical art which is unknown. And you can recover this through research. And that's another paradox of writing. Very often it's thought of as spontaneous, but actually it requires a tremendous amount of homework to get it right. And I think that's what
there was a
referring to.
huge outcry when they cleaned Rembrandt's for the first time.
Yes.
Because
right.
they had always seen him in those golden brown tones, and he actually used colors. And,
that's right.
And people objected to that because they had fallen in love with these rich golden tones that were actually poor shellac.
And there's a big debate about cleaning the Sistine Chapel and the Michelangelo things, about whether or not that grayness that we're used to is actually part of the art, or whether it has been added by dirt and, you know, the candle wax and flames and stuff all going up there, which has changed what he originally painted. And now nobody really knows. They don't know whether that was intended to be bright colors or whether there was heavy modeling in there and whether it had all these grays.
And that controversy goes on. Deerfield, Massachusetts, a restoration that's probably the best of the restorations because it is an actual street and they started very early and so on. They've let the houses age in many cases, and they the original owners in the period that they represent would very much object to not having fresh paint and some bright colors. I mean, the colonial period used a lot of bright colors, and we tend to think of it as not bright because most of the colors are gone or faded from the objects of that period.
So it's really our perception of the way it should be is what is controlling it, rather than the way it actually was. And one would think, too, that, you know, we have this idea, oh, they were Puritans, you know, they were very dour and sour people. And it's that misconception or preconception in coming to the material that reinforces itself rather than seeing what it was actually like at the time.
Yeah, I mean, it surprised me in seeing some early sketches of people vomiting, which was a fairly common theme in the colonial period, drinking punch and vomiting in the bar rooms.
Yeah.
And, you know, this is not our founding fathers, but in fact it was, and if anybody reads very many of Benjamin Franklin's biographies or some of his own writings, will find that he was anything but what we would today call an upstanding citizen in his own behavior. He was involved in a hazing that led to a man's death. He was many times a deceitful person. He was a womanizer. He treated members of his family with total disregard, left his wife and went to England and France for huge periods, and when he knew that she was ill, didn't return until after she had died. And,
but he got to write his own history, so to speak. So
he did, and he also, a lot of the science that he's credited for, he published it. He didn't do the experiments, but he didn't bother to mention that he didn't do the experiments. He just published the experiments, and everybody assumed he was his own PR. And everybody assumed the kite, he didn't hold on the kite. He had a black servant hold on the kite in case it conducted a little better than...
Boy, that changes that whole story around.
It does. I mean, he was not a person that I think that I would like, and you know, I'm glad for his contribution, and I find his history fascinating, but I'm not sure that I'd have much respect for him as a human being. But I think that's true of a lot of people. The haze of history tends to simplify and magnify. I think George Washington is a person who made enormous contributions, but the man was not without enormous ego and a great deal of human frailty. He wore a uniform that was 20 years old around Congress in an oddball sort of way that people commented on, and he was doing it to make the suggestion that he would be a good one to pick for commander-in-chief.
Really?
They did.
So they had the visual perception?
He was kind of a squirrel doing it. I mean, it was really a very strange act for a person. He'd had two terrible defeats. His military history was abominable, and in fact, his lasting quality was better than his military decisions during the Revolution. But he had once built a fort in the bottom of a valley, and between the rains and the bombardment from the hills, he lost, I think, half of his men in a mud hole, and he made a suggestion to, I forget the general's name, to divide his troops in half, and the general took his advice, and they were both defeated in the French and Indian Wars.
Sort of the Custer
great
approach to
general,
warfare.
great general he was, and I think he had good senses that perhaps led by his ego. He did things like, at the end of 2 terms, get out and not ask for honorable titles, but and those have held us in good stead. But he was a human being.
Was he capable of learning from his mistakes, would you say?
I think so.
That might be the best quality of a...
He was such a private individual that we don't know an awful lot about his mind, I think. I mean, I find him one of the most mysterious figures in history.
Actually, Jefferson is like that, too. Extremely inventive, but many personalities, some of which are extremely conflicting.
I just read the other day about a second place that he designed that was his home away from home.
Yeah, that's the one in the woods that they just opened up or something, right? Yeah, miniature little Monticello.
And,
he loved octagons. Everything had to be in octagons.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Well, we're almost out of time. We're getting down to the end. I guess the program here is called the writer's eye, and I think what we've just been discussing indicates that what a writer has to do is sort of see below surfaces, so that the example of Franklin being, on the $100 bill, being somebody who was the founder of Philadelphia. I don't know if it's 100%.
50, I think.
He's not even a president, but he's on the money. I mean, that's real PR, right? He made it to a tremendous status. I mean, he's redesigning Philadelphia to look like Paris and stuff. I mean, the guy had tremendous power. Unbelievable.
He did, through a combination of the fame that he got through his promotion and his ability to read people. I mean, he turned enemies into friends and family into enemies.
But there's a side to politics, which is the theater side, and the side in which you have to be a good actor or a good presenter of a public policy. But then there's the side that you retain as a human, which is quite different from the public image. And the more you study politicians in history, or famous people in history, the more you realize that side is maybe even the more interesting side to them, rather than the PR, what's acceptable for the time, what will go.
I think it's the public image that gets you involved, but to examine any life is an interesting thing, and they're always more interesting outside of the public image, I think.
And the writer's eye, then, would really be the concept of seeing below something, insight as opposed to sight. The title of the program comes from a quote from Conrad, and he talks about the writer's purpose is to make you see, but really what he means is to see the emotion or to see the inner depths in a character that make it multiplicitous, has many, many sides. I think in the beginning we started out talking about Hemingway as a minimalist as opposed to Faulkner as presenting many sides of the picture at once, but actually again we're coming to a reconciliation of those two opposite ways of writing. The minimalist implies that there's many, many points of view in this structure, and the multiplicitous cubist implies there is something that brings it all together. And that is, again, it seems to me that when you write, you're continually involved with paradoxes, or things that appear to be paradoxes because of the way we perceive reality in the outside world. But actually, upon inspection, we realize that's a false way of looking at it.
Well, one is a divergent process, and there's two ways of thinking about anything, divergent and convergent. And I think that with Faulkner, he gives you the evidence, and you converge on the result. And with Hemingway, he gives you sort of this concentrate, and you diverge out into what's going on in the story.
Fascinating. I'm really glad that you came on the program. We really have to wrap it up now, and please come back, because I think there's more to explore here. This is Steve Shaw for the Writer's Eye. Thank you for being with us tonight. Good night.